There is a common misconception when it comes to Stephen King. Of course, that he only writes horror novels. Now, if you know anything about his bibliography, you know that's not true, but when it comes to the general public, yeah, that's mostly what they associate him with. And it doesn't help that all of his books are marketed and classified as horror as well. Like, if you go into a bookstore, you're only going to find his books in horror sections, when in reality, a lot of them might not really fit that category. You gotta be out of your mind to think something like Fairy Tale is a horror book. Yeah, that's all I ever see it be advertised as. And I understand, might want to keep this consistent image up, but it really bothers me because there are a lot of people who just don't read horror because they don't like it, and that's perfectly fine, but they might not be aware that there are a lot of Stephen King books that aren't horror books that they might end up really enjoying, but will never check out because of the stupid categorization. All of this to say, we're talking about 11/22/63. Book I finished a while ago now, and I didn't get a chance to review it at the time, but I still really wanted to talk about it. So this book here came out in 2011. As you can see, it's quite long. It's one of King's longest books for sure. This is a book that was many years in the making. King has gone on record saying he had the idea for this book in his head for decades, but never wrote it at the time because certain events it covers may have been a bit too fresh. So this is a science fiction book. It follows Jake, who is a school teacher, whose friend Al, who runs a restaurant, calls him over one day and shows him something interesting he found. He's got a portal to 1958 in his closet. As you would. And he tells Jake that his intention was to go back to 1958, stay there for several years, and eventually prevent the assassination of John F. Kennedy, as it is his view that preventing this would be a net positive for the world. It would cause a domino effect of all these happy things happening, and the world would be much better off. The issue is that while partaking on this adventure through time, Al caught himself some cancer. So that kind of sucks, and he comes back to the present, 2011, to basically pass the torch on to Jake. After hopping back and forth a few times, Jake can confirm that the time travel is real and he can change the future, and while he isn't necessarily as obsessed with the JFK assassination as Al, he does have a few things he might want to change himself, so he accepts Al's mission and begins his new life in 1958. See, this is a very large, sprawling story as we follow Jake throughout these years of his life living in a different time, but he quickly realizes that time is not really his friend. While time can be changed, time does not want to be changed. And once he meets a young woman named Sadie, he realizes that this might be a lot harder than he thought. So yeah, this book kind of speaks for itself. It's definitely one of King's more famous books in, the past 15 years. And for good reason. It's definitely one of his best. It's a very compelling and interesting story. It has probably my favorite depiction of time travel I've ever seen. I love the idea that time itself is almost like a being that is fighting back. You can outsmart it, you can beat it, but it is like this constant force moving against Jake. It's very Dark Towery is what it is, and I do love me some Dark Tower. I really like the dynamic of Jake, being in this old time period, but of course he has the knowledge of the next 50 years in his head, and the way he interacted with the past was very interesting, and how he always had to be careful not to spoil things. And of course this does lead to a lot of social commentary on the way things were. This being a time period that Stephen King was a kid during, you can tell that he does have, these rose-colored nostalgia goggles for them. So there is a lot of talk about, how simple things were better in the past, how food always tasted better. But as we know, 1950s America, not a great time for everyone, and so the book also explores some of that as well. Also, in general, not a great time to be a character in a Stephen King book, so he does throw in some fun little Easter eggs as well. And as Jake's journey takes him closer and closer to that date of the JFK assassination, the story just becomes more complex, more intense, and it really just transforms from this, cool sci-fi thriller into this really meaningful story about life and death and fate. It's all extremely well done, and it has one of the most touching endings he's ever written. It also helps that all of these characters are absolutely incredible and super well developed, but that's kind of King's thing, that that you read one of his books, that's usually what you get. So yeah, I doubt I'm the first person to say it, but this book is easily one of his bests. And it's a book that, because it's not a horror book, I think more people should definitely be checking out. Like, if you know people who don't read horror stuff and they won't touch this because, Stephen King's name is written in the blood here, let them know, hey, this is just like a normal sci-fi thriller. I think for fans of American history, this book would be especially cool because it's extremely well researched. So yeah, easy 5 stars. Get on it. Now, it's always been my intention this year to get through Needful Things in October, but I just wanted to mention that because I realized, I didn't know this, that the main character of Needful Things had already been featured prominently in another Stephen King story, and I am what you would call a completionist, so I did not really want to read Needful Things without having read The Dark Half. And this book is interesting because it's not one that is often brought up when discussing King books. Like, out of all the stuff he put out in the 80s, this one seems more forgotten than most. And the story of how this came to be is rather interesting. Of course, if you are caught up on your Stephen King lore, you know that during the late 70s to mid-80s, he published several books under a pseudonym, Richard Bachman. Yes, he was writing far too many books for his publishers to keep up with, so he just decided, hey, let's just make up a person. And while the Bachman books were not as popular as King's main stuff, they did find quite a bit of success on their own. In fact, one of his most famous novels, Misery, was originally intended to be a Bachman book, but it wasn't. What happened? Well, it's very hard to keep a secret when you're an author of King status, so eventually the news did come out. And that situation is sort of paralleled in The Dark Half with Thad Beaumont, who is another famous writer, though contrary to King, his pen name actually earned him a lot more popularity. But Thad no longer wants to be only known as his alter ego, so he and his wife decide to spill the beans to everyone, and he will just go back to publishing under his own name. They even do a cute little photo op at a graveyard where they essentially kill off his pen name. But you see, Thad's pen name, George Stark, wasn't, let's just say he wasn't entirely made up. I won't give much away about what's happening here, but let's just say George Stark is very real, and he is very mad that he was killed off. And if Thad does not continue writing with him, well, let's just say he'll kill some babies. He's gonna kill some babies. So we're getting back here into some classic Stephen King supernatural horror stuff. It starts off kind of like a detective book, honestly very reminiscent of Mr. Mercedes. This, of course, came out like 25 years before that, but it's always interesting to see how, King's got ideas and he keeps going with the ones he likes. But yeah, we're basically following Thad as he works with this detective as they investigate murders that are connected to Thad and, the creation of his pen name. And they slowly start to realize that something a little more supernatural is going on and how Thad is connected to all of it. This was not a book I was super excited to read because I have heard from a lot of King readers that this is one of maybe his lesser books, one of his more middling ones. But I gotta say, I was really surprised at how much I loved this book. Do I think it was one of his, best books redefining himself? No, not really. This is kind of the stuff I expect from King, but it's stuff I really like. It was creepy and dirty and disgusting. It was intense and thrilling. Character work was fantastic as always. And some of the imagery, the stuff with the sparrows, I thought this was so good, honestly. So I did give this 4.5 stars. I don't think it's necessarily one of his essential reads, but if you are a big King fan, I think there's a lot to like in this one. Now, one more book I want to talk about, and again, not really a horror one, despite it being one of his most famous novels. But to tie it back to the stigma of Stephen King only being associated with horror stuff, a lot of people don't actually even know he wrote this. For example, my dad is a big fan of the movie. He watches it all the time, like every time it's on TV. He didn't know Stephen King wrote this book, and I imagine a lot of people are the same way. That's right, we talking Dreamcatcher, baby! No, the Green Mile. The Green Mile is very unique when it comes to King's work, mostly in the way that it was presented at the time. Came out in 1996, but not as a novel, but rather 6 separate novellas. And they all come together to tell the story of Paul, an old man who is telling his story from when he worked at a death row prison in the 1930s. As you would imagine, kind of a bleak job. Back then, the electric chair, it was huge. Everyone was using it. But things start to change when a new inmate, John Coffey, is brought in. Coffey is a gigantic, yet very gentle man who was, convicted of some bad some bad stuff, yeah. But after Paul starts to get to know Coffee and spends a bit of time with him, he realizes that not only might Coffee have supernatural abilities, but he might be innocent as well. Uh-oh. This is a very famous story, and, most of that can be attributed to Frank Darabont's movie, which, of course, is just a very iconic film in general. But most of that, of course, was a result of King's fantastic writing in this book. And my god, I do mean fantastic, okay? Obviously, the characters are great. Characters are always great. This is Stephen King. But this book has some of the most hateable, disgusting characters he's ever written. Yet at the same time, Paul is one of his most compelling protagonists as he struggles with, this insane moral dilemma. And the story kept twisting and turning in all these interesting directions. I love the implementation of these supernatural elements here. They don't really overshadow anything to become a book about the supernatural, but they just really complement it super well, and it leads to some very exciting and very touching moments. And yeah, this book is touching. It's also agonizing. While not a horror book per se, there is a lot of just horror in here as, we see what human beings are capable of. And it is visceral and at times very hard to read, but it is extremely effective. And the way that it was told in these 6 different installments, I think adds to all of this. Because these were coming out as their own product, so all 6 of these kind of needed to be bangers. As a result, this is a book that is perfectly paced. There was always interesting stuff happening. The framing of the whole thing being written by Paul as an old man was so fascinating because, he has all these decades of, retrospect, and he can often add insights that we wouldn't have gotten if he was just telling the story as it was happening. And King sometimes gets a lot of shit for his endings, and I kind of get it. King is not really someone who sits down and plots things. He kind of just writes, and whatever happens, happens. And, a lot of times, remarkably, it works out. Not always. But as far as plotting and story structure goes, the way how everything is revealed and how everything clicks together in the end, I think this might be his best book. Am I allowed to say that? Was I ever expecting to find a new favorite Stephen King book? Honestly, no. I had heard amazing things about this book. Of course, it is his highest rated book on Goodreads. But that don't mean anything, and I'm much more partial to the vampires and the spooky stuff and the pandemics and the fantasy. But no, this book made me feel so many different emotions. It was so compelling all the way through. While it's not necessarily a book that really feels the most Stephen King to me, I really do think this is the one, man. I really do. Obviously go and read this, and it's sort of in the same vein as 11/22/63, where this isn't really a horror novel. Now, some horrifying stuff happens, that is for sure. But I think any fan of just general fiction would really like The Green Mile. So yeah, definitely read it if you have not. Mother of Christ. So that development out of the way. We are back with the tier list. Now, a couple notes. I did decide to combine the collections. I'm adding more collections here, and it would just be a bit confusing, especially where I had all the If It Bleeds novellas spread out, and you couldn't tell what was what. Anyway, Bag of Bones. I read this one last year. Definitely not one of his better books. It does have some stuff I really, really like, but also some stuff that I definitely could have done without. Still good overall, though. I would still recommend this book, but yeah, 11/22/63. I'm going to be placing that just under Misery, so in the middle of S tier here. Banger, of course. Cujo, not a book I loved really at all. I thought it had a really cool premise, some good suspense, but the premise did not justify its length, man. It just goes on for way too long. My god, calm down. You Like It Darker, really liked this book. Now that a lot of time has passed, I realized just how memorable, how many of these stories left an impact on me. So I'm going to place that up in A tier. Not every story was a banger, but most of them were. I actually liked the sequel novella to Cujo better than Cujo. The Dark Half, I think I'm going to place just under the Wastelands, you know? This might be a bit unpopular because I know a lot of people don't rank the Dark Half this high, but it really just felt like great classic King to me, and yeah, really had a great time with it. And of course, The Green Mile is going to be dethroning The Stand, which I really never thought would happen. Now, it has been a few years since I've read The Stand, you know, I might eventually go and reread it and change my views, but for now, I'm really feeling The Green Mile. I've read so many good books this year, man. Oh, this is great. So for future King content, of course, I am going to be going through Needful Things next month. That'll probably be it for the rest of the year, though I do want to make a Dark Tower video at some point. I have no idea when I'll get around to that. And after all of that, you know, next year, I hope I'll take out another big chunk of his stuff. The Green Mile actually put me over the 50% mark, so now I have officially read more than half of King's books. That's still a lot more to go, though. But I hope you will all be there for it. So with that, thank you all so much for watching. Leave your thoughts on anything King related in the comments down below. I'm gonna go to sleep now. I'm gonna watch the Salem's Lot trailer again and dream of all the things I'll do to David Zaslav if that movie ends up good and he just dumped it on Max.